There are weekends that split your life into before and after. You don't realize it while it's happening. You're laughing, or you're opening a beer, or you're watching the sun go down over a landscape so wide it makes your chest ache. And you think this is just another trip, just another few days with old friends. And then something happens, and everything you thought you understood about the world quietly folds in on itself. And the person who drives home on Sunday is not the same person who arrived on Friday. I need to tell you about one of those weekends. I need to tell you, because keeping it inside has become worse than saying it out loud. And because 4 other people were there, and none of us have been the same since. And the silence between us has grown so heavy that I'm afraid if I don't break it, we'll all just disappear into it. My name is Joel. I'm a journalist, or I was. I covered local politics, city council meetings, zoning disputes. Small, safe, explainable things. I liked the world when it was explainable. I'm telling you that so you understand where I was coming from. I didn't believe in any of this. Not UFOs, not ghosts. Not the things that supposedly walk through the desert at night, wearing faces that don't belong to them. I was the guy who smiled politely when someone told a campfire story, and then quietly Googled the rational explanation on my phone under the sleeping bag. I was that guy. I'm not anymore. It started with a phone call from Marcus in early October. Marcus and I had been close in college, the kind of close where you share a dorm room for 3 years and develop a language made entirely of inside jokes and comfortable silence. After graduation, we drifted. Not dramatically, just the slow, inevitable way adults drift when jobs and cities pull them in different directions. We texted on birthdays, we liked each other's posts. The usual rituals of people who used to matter to each other and still do, somewhere underneath the years. But this call was different. Marcus sounded hollowed out. His grandfather, Elias, had died. I knew about Elias, though I'd never met him. Marcus talked about him sometimes in college, always with this mixture of deep love and something I could never quite name, confusion maybe, or reverence. Elias had lived alone on a ranch in southeastern Utah for the last 30 years of his life, out past the edge of everything, in a stretch of high desert that the locals apparently called the Quiet. Marcus never explained why they called it that, and I never thought to ask. Elias left the ranch to Marcus, and Marcus wanted to scatter his ashes there, on the mesa behind the house, where Elias used to sit in a lawn chair and watch the sun go down. Marcus didn't want to do it alone. He was asking if I'd come. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The plan came together in that easy way things do when people secretly want an excuse to reconnect. Marcus called Ray, who said yes immediately and loudly, because Ray does everything immediately and loudly. Ray had been Marcus's roommate senior year, ex-military even then, the kind of man who fills a room with his voice and his shoulders, and his absolute refusal to take anything seriously. Ray once told a professor to his face that the final exam was adorable. He got a C+, and he was proud of it. Danny was harder. She and Marcus had dated for 2 years in college, and the breakup was the quiet kind. The kind where nobody yells but everybody aches. She still cared about him. Everyone knew it. She came because she's the kind of person who shows up when it matters, even when showing up is complicated. And then there was Sophie. Sophie was the one none of us fully understood, and I mean that with more admiration than I can express. She was half Lakota on her mother's side, raised between 2 worlds, never fully comfortable in either. She was quiet in the way that certain people are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're listening to something the rest of us can't hear. In college, she studied anthropology and spent her weekends driving to reservations to sit with elders and record oral histories. She never talked about what she heard. When you asked, she'd just say, "Some stories aren't mine to repeat." Sophie said yes to the trip, but she hesitated first, a pause on the phone that lasted just a beat too long. I didn't think about it then. I think about it now. We drove out on a Friday morning, Ray and Marcus in Marcus's truck, me, Danny, and Sophie in my SUV. The drive from Salt Lake City took about 6 hours, and with every hour, the world got emptier. The highway narrowed, the towns shrank, then vanished. The gas stations became sparse, then theoretical. By the time we turned off the last paved road onto a dirt track that Marcus promised led to the ranch, there was nothing around us but red rock and sage and sky. And the sky. I need to talk about the sky. I've been to Montana, I've been to West Texas. I've seen big skies. But this was different. The sky in southeastern Utah doesn't feel like a ceiling. It feels like an ocean turned upside down, and you're standing on the bottom of it, and it goes up forever. And you are so unbelievably small that your existence feels like a rounding error in the math of the universe. It was beautiful. It was also, in some way I couldn't articulate, menacing, like being watched by something too large to have eyes. Danny said something as we bounced along the dirt road. She said, "It's like driving to the end of the world." She meant it as a joke. Sophie, sitting in the back seat with her forehead against the window, whispered, "It is the end of the world." Nobody laughed. We arrived at the ranch around 4 in the afternoon. The property was exactly what you'd picture if someone told you an old man had lived alone in the Utah desert for 3 decades. A single-story house, wood-framed, sun-bleached to the color of old bone. A barn that leaned slightly to the east as if it had gotten tired of standing up straight. A water tank, a rusted windmill that turned slowly in a breeze I couldn't feel. Fencing that marked the property line, though what it was keeping in or out, I couldn't tell. Beyond the fence, in every direction, the desert stretched flat and red and endless until it met the sky. Marcus stood in front of the house for a long time, holding a wooden box, the ashes. He didn't say anything. None of us rushed him. Eventually, he walked up the porch steps and unlocked the door, and we followed him inside. The house smelled like dust and old wood and something faintly herbal, like sage that had been burned years ago and never fully aired out. The furniture was sparse: a couch, a kitchen table, shelves lined with books, mostly about the desert, about geology, about native plants. An old radio, no television, no internet. Elias had lived simply, and the house reflected that. But then I started noticing things. There were lines of salt along every windowsill, not spilled, placed, carefully, deliberately, in unbroken lines from one edge of the frame to the other. I knelt and looked closer. The salt was coarse, the kind you'd buy in bulk. It had been refreshed recently, probably within the last few months, even though Elias had been in the hospital for his final weeks. The door frames had markings. Scratched into the wood was something sharp, maybe a knife, maybe a nail. Small symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't decorative. They were carved with purpose, each one pressed deep into the grain, repeated at precise intervals around every door in the house. And the windows on the north side, every single one of them, had been boarded shut. Not from the outside, the way you'd board up for a storm, from the inside. Heavy planks nailed directly into the window frames, with no gaps except for the thinnest slivers where the boards didn't perfectly meet. I pointed it out to Marcus. He glanced at the boards and shrugged. He got paranoid at the end. Old age, isolation. You know how it goes. I nodded. But I didn't know how it goes, because paranoid people board up random windows. They put extra locks on doors. They do inconsistent, scattered things driven by generalized fear. Elias had boarded up only the north-facing windows, every single one, as if the threat had a direction. We set up camp outside that evening. Marcus had cleared a fire pit behind the house, a ring of stones that Elias had built years ago, and we dragged out some old lawn chairs and unloaded the coolers and started a fire as the sun began its descent. And the sunset, I'll give the desert credit, was magnificent. The sky turned colors I don't have words for, shades of amber and copper and deep violet that bled into each other, like watercolors on wet paper. For a few minutes, sitting around that fire with a cold beer in my hand and my oldest friends around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. The simple, animal pleasure of being warm and fed and surrounded by people who know your real laugh. But then the sun went below the horizon, and the silence arrived. I don't mean it got quiet. I mean the sound stopped, all of it, at once. No crickets, no wind, no distant coyotes, no rustling in the sage, nothing. The silence was so total that it felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could hear the blood moving through my head. The fire crackled, and each crack sounded obscene, like a gunshot in a cathedral. I looked around. Ray was mid-sentence in some story about a bar fight in Pensacola, and even he trailed off. Danny set her beer down slowly, as if the sound of the can touching the armrest might be too loud. Marcus stared into the fire. His jaw was tight. Sophie was standing at the edge of the firelight, maybe 10 feet from the rest of us, facing north. She was perfectly still. Her arms were at her sides, and she was looking out into the darkness beyond the fence, toward the mesa, toward the vast nothing that stretched to the horizon. I walked over to her. "You okay?" She didn't turn. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "This land doesn't want us here." Ray heard it from the fire. He laughed, big and loud, and the sound punched a hole in the silence. Classic Sophie. 2 beers in and she's communing with the earth. He raised his can. "The land can get over it. We brought whiskey." Everyone laughed. Even Sophie smiled, thin and brief, before she turned and walked back to the fire. She sat down between Danny and Marcus, pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and didn't speak again for the rest of the night. We stayed up late. We told old stories. We remembered who we used to be. Ray did his impression of our freshman year RA that still, after 12 years, made Marcus laugh until he couldn't breathe. Danny and Marcus sat on opposite sides of the fire, but kept catching each other's eyes in that way people do when the distance between them is mostly pretend. It was good. It was warm. It was exactly what a Friday night with old friends should feel like. But the silence never left. It sat around our circle like a sixth guest, patient and attentive. And every time the laughter died down, it was there, waiting, heavy and complete. And I could not shake the feeling that it was listening, that it was learning the sound of our voices. I want to say that I felt it coming. I want to tell you that some deep animal part of my brain knew that the night was wrong before it showed me why. But that would be a lie. The truth is, the first hour after we crawled into our tents was ordinary, boring even. Ray snored. Marcus shifted on his sleeping pad every few minutes, the nylon crinkling in the dark. Somewhere in the other tent, Danny murmured something in her sleep, and Sophie was so quiet that if you didn't know she was there, you'd swear the tent was empty. I couldn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. I've always been the last one awake, my brain running through tomorrow's to-do list, replaying conversations, chewing on things that don't need chewing. That night, I lay on my back and stared at the tent ceiling and listened to the silence and tried to convince myself it was peaceful. It wasn't, but I was trying. Around midnight, maybe a little after, I gave up on sleep and unzipped the tent. I needed air, I needed to move, I needed to stand somewhere other than inside that thin nylon shell and remind myself that the world was still large and open and normal. I stepped out. The fire had burned down to a bed of orange coals, still giving off a faint warmth. The air was cold, properly cold, the way desert air gets when the sun disappears and the ground releases all the heat it borrowed during the day. I could see my breath. Above me, the sky was absurd. I've mentioned the sky already, but at night, out there with no light pollution, for 100 miles in any direction, the sky doesn't just have stars, it's made of them. The Milky Way wasn't a faint smear, it was a river, thick and luminous, cutting the sky in half like a scar made of light. I stood there with my head tilted back and my mouth slightly open, and for a moment, just for a moment, the silence felt holy instead of hostile. Then I noticed the gap. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. There was a section of the sky roughly to the northwest where the stars were missing. Not dim, not obscured by clouds. There were no clouds. The stars were simply absent, as if something had taken a piece of the sky and replaced it with pure black. The shape was vaguely triangular, wider at one end, tapering at the other. If you've ever held your hand up against a starry sky and noticed the silhouette, it was like that. Except my hand is not a quarter mile wide. I stared at it. My brain offered rational explanations. A cloud I couldn't see. A trick of my eyes adjusting to the dark. A mountain on the horizon I hadn't noticed during the day. Each explanation arrived and collapsed within seconds because the shape was moving. Slowly, deliberately. Drifting across the star field like a ship crossing an ocean, and the stars winked out along its leading edge and reappeared behind it. And I understood, with a clarity that made my knees feel soft, that something enormous was above us. I called out. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked on Marcus's name. "Marcus, Ray, get out here. Get out here now." Marcus was out first. He followed my pointing hand and found the shape, and he went still. Not surprised still, resigned still, like he was seeing something he'd been told about but hoped was exaggerated. Ray came out a few seconds later, shirtless and irritated, and the irritation lasted exactly as long as it took him to look up. "What the hell?" Ray said. Not a question, a statement. Danny and Sophie emerged from their tent. Danny grabbed my arm, hard enough to leave marks I'd find the next morning. Sophie stood apart from us, arms crossed, chin raised, watching the shape with an expression I can only describe as recognition. Then the lights came on. 3 of them, pale orange, almost amber, arranged in a line along what I suppose was the underside of the thing. If it had an underside, if words like underside even apply to something like that. They didn't blink. They didn't flicker. They pulsed. Slowly, rhythmically, brightening and dimming in a pattern that felt organic rather than mechanical. I remember thinking insanely that it looked like breathing, like the lights were lungs expanding and contracting, and the thing above us was alive. We watched it for 90 seconds. I know the exact duration because Ray, God bless his instincts, had pulled out his phone and started recording, and the timestamp later confirmed it. 90 seconds of 5 adults standing in the Utah desert, with their necks craned and their hearts hammering, watching something that was not a plane, was not a satellite, was not a helicopter, was not a drone, was not anything that any of us had a word for. It didn't make a sound. That's the part that undid me. Something that large, that close, moving through the atmosphere should have made noise. Wind displacement, engine hum, something. But there was nothing. The same suffocating silence that had settled over the ranch now felt like the thing's silence, as if the quiet we'd been sitting in all evening was the sound of this object holding its breath. And then it left. I don't know how else to describe it. It didn't accelerate in the way I understand acceleration, where a thing is here and then it's there, and you can track the movement between those 2 points. It was present, and then it was absent. The stars that had been blocked by its mass blinked back into existence all at once, and the sky was whole again, and the thing was gone, and the desert was exactly as empty as it had been before, as if the last 90 seconds had been a hallucination shared by 5 people, simultaneously. The silence lasted another 3 seconds, then Ray said a word I won't repeat, followed by 5 more that I also won't repeat, and the night exploded. Everyone was talking at once. Ray was waving his phone, shouting that he got it on video. He got the whole thing. Danny was pacing in tight circles, her hands in her hair, saying, "That was real, tell me that was real," to no one in particular. Marcus was standing exactly where he'd been standing, unmoving, his face unreadable. Sophie had sat down on the ground, cross-legged, eyes closed, as if she was meditating or praying or trying to convince herself to stay in her body. Ray played back the footage. We huddled around the phone. The screen showed black, pure, featureless, unwavering black. 90 seconds of night sky with nothing in it. No shape, no lights, no evidence whatsoever that anything had been there. "No," Ray said. He rewound it, played it again. Black, again, black. No, 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 I was pointing right at it. I watched myself point right at it. "It doesn't matter," Danny said. She was shaking, not from the cold. "We all saw it. 5 people saw it." "What did we see?" I asked. The journalist in me already structuring, already organizing, already reaching for the neat narrative that would make this experience fit into the world I understood. "Seriously, what are we saying this was?" Nobody answered. We sat around the dead fire for the next 2 hours, and we talked about what we'd seen. We went in circles, the way people do when they've experienced something that has no comfortable category. Ray was electric, buzzing with a manic energy I hadn't seen in him since college. He was already planning who to contact, news stations, podcasters, MUFON. He wanted the world to know. Danny was quieter but no less shaken, asking careful questions, trying to determine if we'd all seen the same details. The same size, the same lights, the same movement. We had. Every detail matched. I was doing what I always do. I was building the story in my head. The lead, the quotes, the corroborating details. I was thinking about how to write it, because writing about things is how I make them manageable. This is the biggest story of my life, I thought. 5 witnesses, a clear sighting, a coherent account. This is the kind of thing that changes everything. I was wrong. It wouldn't change anything. Because something else was about to happen that would make me forget the sky entirely. But I didn't know that yet. The person I was watching most was Marcus. While the rest of us vibrated with adrenaline and disbelief, Marcus sat in his chair with his hands folded in his lap and said almost nothing. His calm wasn't the calm of shock, it was the calm of confirmation. Like a man who'd been told the stove was hot and had just touched it, and found that yes, it was exactly as hot as he'd been warned. I sat next to him. "You're awfully quiet for a guy who just saw a UFO." He almost smiled. "My grandfather saw things out here too." I waited. Marcus has always been the kind of person who talks when he's ready, not when you ask. When I was a kid, he'd mention it sometimes. Lights, shapes, things in the sky that moved wrong. He'd tell my mom about it and she'd change the subject, and he learned to stop bringing it up. Marcus paused, picked at the label on his beer. But he stopped talking about the sky stuff pretty early on, like it became the least interesting thing happening out here. The sentence landed in my chest like a stone dropped in still water. "What did he talk about instead?" I asked. Marcus looked at me. In the faint glow of the coals, his face was half lit, half shadow, and his eyes were the oldest I'd ever seen them. He didn't answer. The group eventually wound down. The adrenaline metabolized into exhaustion, and one by one, we retreated to our tents. Ray was the last, still murmuring about contacting the news, still checking his phone as if the footage might suddenly materialize. By 3 in the morning, the camp was quiet. Everyone was asleep. Everyone except me. I was lying in my tent, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, running the sighting through my memory for the 100th time when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the skittering of an animal, not the soft pad of a coyote, or the shuffle of a rabbit. Footsteps, two-legged, bipedal, measured, deliberate. Something was walking around the camp, tracing a wide circle at a distance I estimated at maybe 40 yards from the tents. I held my breath and listened. The footsteps were wrong. I knew it immediately, the way you know a musical note is flat, even if you can't name the note. The rhythm was human, left, right, but the spacing was off. The gap between each step was too long. Not like someone walking slowly, like someone whose legs were too long for their body, so each stride covered a distance that a normal human stride shouldn't cover. It was the gait of something shaped almost like a person, but built on a slightly different blueprint. I counted the steps. I couldn't help it. It's what I do. I count things when I'm afraid because numbers are reliable and fear is not. The thing made a full circuit of the camp in what I calculated to be 23 steps. 23 steps to cover a circle with a circumference of about 250 yards. Do the math. Each step was roughly 11 feet. Nothing walks like that. The circuit completed, the footsteps stopped, and I lay there in my sleeping bag with my heart trying to crack through my ribs. And I waited, and I told myself it was a deer, it was an elk, it was anything. It was everything other than what it sounded like. Then I heard my name. "Joel," whispered. From the darkness outside the tent, close, maybe 15 feet, maybe 10, in Marcus's voice. Marcus was lying 3 feet from me. I could hear his breathing. Slow, deep, asleep, unmistakably asleep. The kind of breathing you can't fake, the unconscious rhythm of a man who has fallen fully out of the waking world. But his voice was outside the tent, saying my name, with his exact inflection, his exact timbre, the way Marcus says Joel with a slight drop on the second letter, almost swallowing the L, a tiny vocal habit so specific that only someone who'd known him for 12 years would recognize it. Whatever was outside recognized it. Joel. Again, patient, almost friendly, as if it had all the time in the world, as if it knew I was listening and was content to wait. I did not move, I did not breathe, I did not unzip the tent, I did not look. The voice did not come a third time. Eventually, the silence returned. The same massive, pressing silence that I was beginning to understand was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that consumed it. And I lay in that tent with my eyes wide open and my fists clenched around my sleeping bag, and I did not sleep. Not for 1 second. Not until the sky turned gray and the first light touched the mesa and the world remembered how to be a place where things made sense. But even in the daylight, even with the sun climbing and the air warming and the birds finally, blessedly starting to sing, I knew something had changed. Something fundamental, something I couldn't undo. Because the UFO was extraordinary. The UFO was impossible. The UFO broke every rule I had about how the universe works. But the thing that said my name in my best friend's voice, the thing that walked on legs too long for any living creature, the thing that circled our camp with the patience of a predator, that has already decided when it will feed. That was worse, and I hadn't even begun to understand how much worse it would get. Daylight is a liar. I know that now. But that morning, I believed it. I believed every lie it told me. The sun came up slow and golden, spilling across the mesa like warm water, and the desert transformed. The landscape that had felt hostile and limitless in the dark became beautiful in the way that only empty places can be beautiful. The red rock caught the early light and turned the color of rust and honey. The sage bushes threw long purple shadows across the sand. A hawk circled high above the mesa, riding a thermal, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I heard birdsong. Actual, normal, real birdsong. A canyon wren somewhere in the rocks, trilling out its descending melody like a tiny, feathered apology for the night before. I crawled out of the tent with grit in my eyes and a headache from not sleeping, and a desperate, almost physical need to stand in the sunlight and let it burn away everything I'd heard in the dark. Marcus was already up. He was in the kitchen making coffee on Elias's old gas stove, and the sound of the percolator bubbling was so ordinary, so domestic, that I almost cried. Ray stumbled out next, looking like he'd slept hard and well, because of course he had. Ray could sleep through a bombing. He stretched, scratched his stomach, squinted at the sky as if hoping the UFO might make a daytime encore, and declared, "Best night's sleep I've had in months." I wanted to hit him. Danny and Sophie emerged from their tent a few minutes later. Danny looked tired but steady. Sophie looked the way she always looked, contained and watchful, but there was something new behind her eyes, something cautious. I told them over coffee about the footsteps, about the voice. I tried to keep it clinical, factual, the way I'd report a story, just the details, just what I heard. I left out the part where I was so afraid that I could feel my own pulse in my teeth. Ray didn't even let me finish. "Coyote," he said, like he was diagnosing a cough. "They make all kinds of weird sounds. And the voice thing? That was a dream. You were half asleep, Joel. Your brain was still processing the UFO. It filled in the blanks. I wasn't asleep. You thought you weren't asleep. There's a difference." I looked at the others. Danny was watching me carefully, her coffee mug held in both hands, close to her face like a shield. She didn't say Ray was right. She didn't say I was wrong. She just watched. Sophie said nothing. She sipped her coffee and stared at the north side of the house, at the boarded windows, at the planks nailed in from the inside, and her silence said more than Ray's dismissal ever could. Marcus didn't weigh in. He'd been in Elias's study since before I came inside, and when I found him there, he was sitting at the old desk with a leather-bound journal open in front of him. Elias's handwriting, small, cramped, urgent. Marcus closed the journal the moment I appeared in the doorway, pressing it flat with both hands as if he was holding it shut. "Anything interesting?" I asked. "Casual? Journalistic?" "Just ranch stuff," Marcus said. He looked me in the eyes when he said it. Marcus has never been a good liar. His tells are subtle but consistent. When he lies, his left hand moves to his jaw, just for a second. A quick touch that he probably doesn't know he does. He touched his jaw. I didn't push it. I should have. But the morning was too bright and the coffee was too warm, and I wasn't ready to fight for the truth when the truth might be something I didn't want to hold. After breakfast, we explored the property. Marcus said it would be good to stretch our legs, see the place in daylight, get a sense of where Elias had spent his last 3 decades. It seemed reasonable. It seemed like a normal thing to do on a Saturday morning at a dead man's ranch. It was neither of those things, but we didn't know that yet. The first thing we found was the posts. Wooden stakes about 4 feet tall, driven into the ground in a wide circle around the entire property. They were spaced roughly 20 feet apart, and each one had a small mirror attached to it, nailed to the flat top of the post, angled slightly outward. Not toward the house, away from it. Facing the desert, facing whatever might approach from outside the perimeter. I counted them. 31 posts, 31 mirrors. Some were cracked from weather and age, but most were intact, their surfaces still reflective, still catching the morning sun and throwing small daggers of light across the sand. It must have taken Elias weeks to set them all, maybe months. "What are these for?" Danny asked. "Probably kept the deer away," Ray said. "Animals don't like reflections, confuses them." Nobody pointed out that deer don't typically require a military-grade perimeter defense. Nobody pointed out that the mirrors were all aimed outward at roughly the height of a human face. We kept walking. At the four corners of the property, roughly aligned with the compass points, we found small piles of animal bones. Bleached white by the sun, arranged carefully, not scattered. Each pile contained what looked like the skeleton of a small animal, a rabbit maybe, or a prairie dog, laid out in a pattern that was too deliberate to be the work of a predator. The bones at the north pile were different, larger, the skull of something with canine teeth, a coyote perhaps, placed at the center of the arrangement, its empty eye sockets facing outward. Facing north, everything faced north. Behind the barn, we found the circle, a patch of earth about 15 feet in diameter where nothing grew. Not a weed, not a blade of dried grass, not a single sprig of sage. The surrounding ground was covered in the usual desert scrub, the hardy, stubborn plants that can survive on almost no water. And then, as if someone had drawn a line with a compass, the vegetation stopped. The bare earth inside the circle was hard-packed and slightly darker than the soil around it. I knelt and pressed my palm against it. It was warm, not sun-warm, warm from somewhere beneath, as if the ground itself was running a low fever. "Huh," Ray said, standing at the edge. "Salt flat, maybe? Sometimes the minerals kill everything in a patch." "It's a perfect circle, Ray," Danny said quietly. "Nature does circles. Ever seen a fairy ring? This isn't a fairy ring." We left the circle. I looked back once. The sunlight hit it differently than the surrounding ground, as if the light itself didn't want to linger there. Then we checked the barn. The barn was mostly empty. Old tools, a workbench, coils of wire, the smell of dry wood and ancient hay. Nothing remarkable. Until Ray walked around to the north-facing exterior wall and called us over. Claw marks. 4 parallel gouges in the wood, deep enough that I could fit my fingertip into the grooves. They started at approximately 7 feet above the ground, which was already wrong, because most animals that scratch at barn walls do it at shoulder height, 3 or 4 feet up. These started at 7 feet, and they didn't drag downward, which is what claws do when an animal reaches up and pulls down. These dragged upward, from 7 feet to nearly the roofline. 12 feet up, 4 long, splintered furrows raked into the wood as if something had gripped the wall at 7 feet and climbed. Ray stared at them for a long time. He didn't say mountain lion. He didn't say bear. He touched the grooves with his fingers and pulled his hand back. And he looked at Marcus, and Marcus looked at the ground. "Your grandpa was a weird dude, Marcus," Ray said. But the bravado was thinner now, stretched over something uneasy. "He wasn't weird," Marcus said. "He was careful." We were walking back to the house when the truck appeared. It came up the dirt road trailing a plume of dust that rose into the still air and hung there, suspended, as if the atmosphere itself was too tired to disperse it. An old Chevy, blue once, now faded to a gray that matched the desert. It stopped about 50 feet from the house and the engine shut off, but the driver didn't get out. Marcus walked over. The rest of us followed at a distance. The driver was an old Navajo man, deep lines in his face, a weathered cowboy hat, hands resting on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. He looked at Marcus through the open window with an expression that I initially read as hostility, but later understood was something else entirely. "You Elias's boy?" the man asked. "Grandson," Marcus said. "I'm Henry Sosi. I live about 8 miles east. Your grandfather and I had an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "The kind where I check on his property when he's away, and he doesn't ask me questions I don't want to answer." Henry's eyes moved past Marcus, scanning our group. They settled on Sophie for a moment, a beat too long, and then he looked away as if he'd seen something he didn't like. "You all staying another night?" Marcus hesitated, then, "Yes." Henry nodded slowly, the nod of a man who expected that answer and wished he hadn't gotten it. "Your grandfather knew the rules," Henry said. "I hope he taught you." "What rules?" Marcus asked. But Henry was already rolling up the window. He turned the key, the engine coughed back to life, and the truck reversed down the dirt road and disappeared the way it had come, swallowed by its own dust cloud. We stood there for a moment. Danny was the first to speak. "That was weird." He was afraid. Sophie said. We all turned to look at her. She was standing slightly apart from the group, her arms wrapped around herself despite the heat. Afraid of what? I asked. Of us. Sophie's voice was flat, careful, as if she was choosing each word individually and placing it down like a card in a game she didn't want to play. Not for us, of us. He looked at us the way you look at something that might already be contaminated. Like one of us might already be wrong. Nobody responded. The wind picked up for the first time all day. A thin, directionless breeze that smelled like sage and dust and something faintly metallic. And it carried Sophie's words away before any of us could figure out what to do with them. That afternoon, I found my moment. Marcus went to the barn with Ray to look at some old equipment Elias had left behind. Danny and Sophie sat on the porch talking in low voices. I slipped into the study. Elias's journal was where Marcus had left it, on the desk, beneath a stack of old seed catalogs. It was leather-bound, the leather soft and dark from years of handling. The pages were filled with that cramped handwriting, small enough that I had to lean close to read it, and the ink had faded to a brownish gray that made certain words difficult to parse. But I could read enough, more than enough. I flipped through the pages. Most of it was, as Marcus had said, ranch stuff. Feed orders, weather observations, notes on well maintenance. But woven between the mundane entries, like a second story running parallel to the first, were other observations. Written in the same steady hand, but with a quality that was harder to define. The handwriting didn't change, but the pressure did. The words were pressed deeper into the page, as if Elias had been gripping the pen too hard. One entry, dated 8 years ago. It watches from the north, always the north. 3 nights now. I left the lantern burning in the north window, and in the morning the glass was cracked from the outside. Not broken, cracked, as if something pressed its face against it very slowly for a very long time. Another, 6 years ago. Do not answer if it calls your name. It called mine last night. Used Martha's voice. Martha was Elias's wife. She had been dead for over 20 years when he wrote that entry. Another, 4 years ago. I boarded the windows. It stood there for 6 hours. It wore David's face. David has been dead for 9 years. I didn't know who David was. A friend maybe, a neighbor. Someone Elias had loved and lost, and then been forced to see again. Standing outside his window in the dead of night, wearing the face of a dead man like a borrowed coat. And then the entry that stopped me. That made me set the journal down and put my hands flat on the desk, and breathe very carefully through my nose until my heart rate came back to something approaching normal. It was dated 2 years ago. It was the last substantial entry in the journal. And it said, "The lights in the sky come first. They are not the danger. They are the dinner bell." I closed the journal. I put it back under the seed catalogs. I walked out of the study and into the afternoon sunlight and stood on the porch and watched the shadow of the mesa creep slowly eastward across the desert floor. The sun was going down. In a few hours, it would be dark again. And whatever had circled our camp last night, whatever had whispered my name in my best friend's voice, whatever had stood outside Elias's window wearing the faces of the dead, would come back. I should have told the others what I'd read. I should have marched to the barn and found Marcus and said, "We need to leave, right now, before sunset. Your grandfather wasn't paranoid. He was under siege, and the things he was defending against are still here, and they know we're here, and we need to go." I didn't. I told myself I needed more information. I told myself I didn't want to cause a panic. I told myself there was probably a rational explanation buried somewhere in those journal pages that I hadn't found yet. But the truth is simpler and uglier than any of those excuses. I didn't tell them because I was a journalist, and journalists don't run from stories. They run toward them. And some part of me, some reckless, curious, profoundly stupid part of me, wanted to know what happened next. I would regret that decision for the rest of my life. The second sunset was wrong. I don't mean it was ugly, I mean the colors were wrong. The first night's sunset had been gorgeous, all amber and copper and violet, the kind of sky you photograph and set as your phone wallpaper. This one was different. The sky turned a color I'd never seen before and haven't seen since. Somewhere between rust and bruise, a deep reddish purple that didn't blend into the horizon the way sunsets are supposed to. It sat on top of the landscape like a stain. The light it cast made everything look slightly unfamiliar. The rocks a shade too dark, the shadows a few degrees too sharp. the sage bushes throwing silhouettes that looked like crouching figures if you caught them at the wrong angle. Danny noticed it too. She was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the sky change, and she said, "Does the light look weird to you?" She said it casually, the way you'd mentioned that the milk smells off, but I could hear the wire beneath the words. "It's the altitude," I said. "Thin air changes how light scatters." I don't know if that's true. I said it because I needed it to be true. Because the alternative was that the sky itself was warning us, and I wasn't ready to live in a world where the sky had opinions. The silence came back with the darkness. It rolled in from the north like a tide, filling the spaces between the rocks, soaking into the ground, pressing against the walls of the house. One moment I could hear the wind, the next, nothing. The same absolute, suffocating nothing from the night before. Except this time, we all felt it. This time, nobody pretended it was peaceful. Marcus made the call. "We're sleeping inside tonight." He said it like it was a practical decision. Temperature, comfort, the novelty of sleeping in a real bed. But his eyes told a different story. His eyes told the story of a man who'd spent the afternoon reading his dead grandfather's journal, and had found things in it that he couldn't say out loud. Nobody argued. We moved our sleeping bags into the main room of the house, the largest room, the one with the stone fireplace and the heavy front door with 3 locks and the windows that faced south and east, the windows Elias had left unboarded, the windows that faced away from whatever he'd been afraid of. Marcus built a fire. The wood was old and dry, and it caught fast, filling the room with crackling warmth and the smell of cedar. Lanterns on the mantel, sleeping bags on the floor. It should have felt cozy. It felt like a bunker. I watched Marcus as the others settled in. He moved around the room with a quiet purpose that unsettled me more than anything else that day. He checked the front door. 3 locks, a deadbolt, a chain, and a sliding bolt that Elias had installed himself. Heavy iron, the kind of hardware you'd expect on a bank vault, not a ranch house door. Marcus tested each one, then he walked to every window in the room and ran his finger along the sill, checking the salt lines. Where the salt was thin, he added more from a canister he'd found in the kitchen. He did this without comment, without explanation, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, as if every person in every house on every Saturday evening walks a perimeter and refreshes the salt. I caught his eye as he passed me. He paused. For a moment I thought he was going to tell me everything. Open the journal, show me the pages, explain what we were really dealing with. But he just said, "Make sure nobody opens the north windows," and kept walking. Before the last of the light went, we scattered the ashes. Marcus had been carrying the wooden box since we arrived, and I think the weight of it, not the physical weight, but the other kind, had been pressing on him in ways none of us fully understood. We walked out to the mesa behind the house, the 5 of us in a loose group, and the sky above us was that impossible bruised color, and the desert stretched out in every direction like an ocean with no shore. Marcus opened the box. The ashes were gray and fine, lighter than I expected, and they sat in the box like a quiet accusation, the remains of a man reduced to something you could hold in 2 hands. "I don't have a speech," Marcus said. His voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. He would have hated a speech. He was the kind of man who said what he meant in as few words as possible, and he meant every single one of them. He paused, looked out at the desert, blinked hard. "He lived out here alone for 30 years. People thought he was crazy. My mom thought he was crazy. I think maybe for a while, even I thought he was crazy, but he wasn't." Marcus's voice cracked on the last word, and he swallowed hard. He was doing something important. He was standing guard, and I didn't understand that until it was too late to thank him. He tilted the box. The ashes caught a breeze that I couldn't feel and drifted out over the mesa, spreading thin and pale against the darkening sky, settling onto the red earth like snow that would never melt. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have diminished the moment. We just stood there, 5 people on the edge of the desert, watching a man's remains become part of the land he'd spent his life protecting. We turned to walk back to the house. Danny stopped. She stopped so abruptly that Sophie, walking behind her, nearly collided with her back. Danny's hand came up, slow, trembling, and pointed toward the north. Something standing in the trees. The tree line was a thin row of junipers, maybe 200 yards from the house, running along the base of a low ridge. In the dying light, the trees were dark silhouettes against the bruised sky, gnarled and wind-bent, and between two of them, standing perfectly still, was a shape. It was tall, that was the first thing. Too tall, not dramatically, not monstrously, but enough that my brain flagged it as incorrect. Maybe 6.5 feet, maybe 7, with proportions that were subtly off in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The shoulders were too narrow for the height. The arms, or what I thought were arms, hung too far past where the hips should have been. It was facing us. I was sure of that much. It was oriented toward our group with the patient stillness of something that had been watching for a long time and saw no reason to hide. We stared. It didn't move. The light was failing and the distance was considerable, and I ordered myself, to consider the possibility that I was looking at a dead tree, a post, a trick of shadow and parallax and fear. "It's a tree," I said. The words sounded ridiculous, even as I said them. "Trees don't have shoulders," Danny whispered. Ray cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the darkness. "Hey, you out there, we see you." His voice carried across the flat desert and hit the tree line and came back as a faint echo. The shape did not react, did not flinch, did not adjust. It stood there with the absolute immobility of something that is not startled because it cannot be startled, because it has no reason to be afraid of anything it is looking at. We watched for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes. The shape remained. The light continued to fail. "Inside," Marcus said. "Now." We went inside. Marcus locked the door. All 3 locks, deadbolt, chain, iron bolt. He checked the salt. He checked the windows. He pulled the curtains on the south and east windows, the unboarded ones, even though there was nothing on those sides to see. I sat by the fire and tried to feel safe and failed completely. The knock came at 10:47. I know the exact time because I was staring at my phone, watching the minutes crawl by, counting them the way a prisoner counts days. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate, spaced evenly. The sound of knuckles against wood, against the heavy front door with its 3 locks, and the sound was polite. That's the word that came to mind, polite. The kind of knock a neighbor makes when they stop by with a casserole. We all froze. 5 people in a circle of firelight, and every one of us stopped breathing at the same time. Silence. Then a voice, from just outside the door. A woman's voice, warm and sweet and slightly worried. The voice of someone who loves you and has come to check on you. "Danny, honey, open the door." Danny made a sound, a small, involuntary sound, the kind of sound you make when someone punches you in the stomach and all the air leaves your body at once. She went white, not pale, white. The blood drained from her face so fast that I thought she was going to faint. "That's my mother," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "That's my mother's voice. Danny's mother lives in Connecticut. Danny's mother has never been to Utah. Danny's mother has a very specific voice, a slight Rhode Island accent, inherited from her own mother, a way of saying honey with the emphasis landing just past the first syllable, a warmth in her vowels that is as distinct and unreplicable as a fingerprint." The voice outside got it almost right. Almost. 95%. Close enough that your heart would recognize it. Close enough that your body would respond before your brain could intervene. But there was something in the cadence, something mechanical. The rhythm of the words was slightly off, like a song played at the wrong tempo, and the pauses between words were a fraction of a second too uniform, as if whatever was producing the sound was working from a recording rather than a memory. "Honey, it's cold out here. Open the door." Danny stood up. She took a step toward the door. I don't think she decided to. I think her body moved before her mind could stop it, because that voice was her mother's voice. And when your mother calls you, you go. That's deeper than thought. That's wiring. Marcus caught her arm, gently but firmly. He pulled her back. "Don't answer," he said. "Don't go near the door. Don't look through the windows." "That's my mother," Danny said again. And now she was crying. "No," Marcus said, "it isn't." The knocking continued, for 45 minutes. I timed it. The knocks came in sets of 3, separated by long, patient silences, and each set was accompanied by a different voice. Danny's mother, then my mother, calling my name in the exact pitch and rhythm that my mother has used since I was 6 years old. Then a woman's voice that made Ray go rigid, a voice he later confirmed was his ex-wife, a woman who lived in Virginia and had no reason and no ability to be standing outside a ranch house in southeastern Utah at 11 o'clock at night. Then a child's voice, small, uncertain, crying softly. "Please let me in. Please. I'm scared. Please." None of us recognized it, and somehow that was worse. The familiar voices were horrifying because we knew them. The child's voice was horrifying because we didn't, because it meant that whatever was outside had a library, a collection, voices it had gathered from somewhere, from someone. Voices that belonged to people we had never met, and I did not want to think about how it had acquired them. At 11:32, the knocking stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, and we sat in the firelight and listened to our own breathing and didn't speak. At 1:30 in the morning, Ray got up to get water. He was quiet about it, moving carefully so he wouldn't step on anyone. The kitchen was adjacent to the main room, separated by an open doorway. The kitchen window faced north. It was boarded, heavy planks nailed to the frame, but between the planks there were gaps. Thin gaps, a quarter inch at most, where the boards didn't perfectly meet. I heard Ray turn on the tap. I heard the water run. Then I heard the water stop, and then I heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Ray was standing in the kitchen, not making a sound, for what felt like a very long time. When he came back, he moved differently. The swagger was gone. The big, confident, Ray fills a room physicality that I had known for 12 years was gone, replaced by something smaller, something diminished, as if parts of him had been removed while he stood in that kitchen. He sat down on his sleeping bag. He put his hands on his knees, and he began to cry. Ray does not cry. I need you to understand that. In 12 years, I have never seen that man shed a tear. Not when his marriage ended. Not when his father died. Not during the things he saw overseas that he never talks about. Ray is the man who laughs. Ray is the man who deflects. Ray is the man who makes a joke when the world gets too heavy because humor is the only load-bearing wall in his emotional architecture. Ray was sitting on the floor of a dead man's house in the middle of the desert, weeping silently, tears running down his face and into his beard, his massive shoulders hitching with each breath. And the rest of us sat there and watched, and we were more afraid than we had been at any other point in the night, because if Ray was broken, then whatever was outside was real in a way that we could no longer negotiate with. "Ray," I said, softly, the way you'd talk to someone on a ledge. "What did you see?" He didn't answer for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was flat, scraped clean of everything that usually made it Ray's voice. I looked through the gap, in the boards. I just wanted to see. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a person, some drifter, something I could explain. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. It was right there, right against the boards. Its face was pressed against the wood, and it was looking through the gap from the other side. We were looking at each other, inches apart. It was smiling. He paused, swallowed. It had too many teeth, not like monster movie teeth. Like someone who has the right kind of teeth, but the wrong number of them. Rows that went too far back. And the smile was too wide. It went past where a smile should stop. Another pause, longer this time. It had my face. The words landed in the room like a body hitting the floor. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. "It had my face," Ray said again. "My nose, my brow, my jawline. But the eyes were wrong. The eyes were flat, like looking at a photograph of yourself. Except the photograph is looking back at you. And it's smiling, and it has too many teeth. And it is pressed against the other side of a board that is the only thing between you and it." Ray pulled his sleeping bag over his shoulders and lay down with his back to the room. And he didn't say another word for the rest of the night. The room was quiet. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the walls, the old wood of the house settled and groaned, and every creak sounded like a footstep, and every groan sounded like a voice. Sophie spoke. She had been silent for hours. She'd been sitting in the corner of the room, her knees drawn up to her chest, her hands pressed over her ears as if trying to block out a sound that the rest of us couldn't hear. But now she dropped her hands and lifted her head and looked at us, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been fighting a losing battle with a truth she didn't want to own. "It's a skinwalker," she said. The word hung in the air. I'd heard it before, in the vague, pop culture, internet creepypasta way that most people have heard it. A scary story, a Reddit thread, a clip from some paranormal TV show with dramatic reenactments and ominous music. I didn't know what it actually meant. I didn't know what it actually was. Sophie told us, not the way the internet tells it. Not with excitement or entertainment, or the safe, thrilling distance of fiction. She told us the way someone tells you about a car accident they survived. Quietly, with precision, and with the kind of fear that doesn't raise its voice because raising your voice means losing control, and losing control means it wins. My grandmother told me about them when I was 12, Sophie said. She sat me down in her kitchen and she told me, and when she was done, she said, "I will never speak about this again, and neither will you, because speaking about them is how they find you." I broke that rule tonight because I think it's already too late for that. She took a breath. They're not animals. They're not ghosts. They're not demons, not the way Christians mean it. They were people, medicine people, healers, men and women who had a real knowledge, real power, the kind that comes from decades of learning. But they chose wrong. They chose the dark path. They killed someone close to them, someone who trusted them, to gain the power to change, to wear other shapes, other skins. She looked at the boarded window. They mimic voices because they study you. They watch you for a long time before they approach. They learn how you talk, how you move, what you're afraid of, who you love. They use it against you. They build a version of you that's close enough to fool the people around you, and then they use that to get inside. Inside your house, inside your circle, inside your head. "What does it want?" I asked. My voice sounded like someone else's voice, small and far away. Sophie looked at me. "It wants to come inside." The fire popped, a log shifted. Sparks spiraled up toward the chimney. And from outside the house, from the north side, from just beyond the boarded windows, came Sophie's voice. A perfect copy, every inflection, every breath. The exact cadence of her last 4 words, played back to us with the fidelity of a studio recording. "It wants to come inside." Nobody screamed. That's the thing people don't understand about real terror. You don't scream. Screaming is for surprises, for jump scares, for the moment of shock before your brain catches up. This wasn't shock. This was understanding. This was the moment where the last door in your mind, the one you've been holding shut with both hands and all your weight, finally opens. And behind it is not the monster, but the knowledge that the monster is real, and has been real, and has been standing just outside the wall, listening, learning, waiting, for longer than you want to calculate. We sat in silence. 5 people in a circle of dying firelight, in a dead man's house, in the middle of a desert that didn't want them, and outside in the dark, something that used to be human wore our faces and spoke with our voices and pressed itself against the walls and waited for us to make a mistake. The longest night hadn't even started yet. 2 in the morning. That's when the siege began. I use the word deliberately. I've thought about it for a long time, searched for something more precise, more clinical, and nothing fits better. It was a siege, not a haunting, not a visit, not an encounter. A siege implies patience and strategy and the sustained application of pressure against a fortified position, and that is exactly what happened to us between 2 and 4 in the morning on that second night. It started on the roof. The first sound was a single footstep, heavy. Directly above us, above the main room where we lay in our sleeping bags, pretending that proximity to each other constituted safety. 1 footstep, then nothing, then another. 3 seconds later, a few feet to the left. Then another, and another. Slow, measured, purposeful. The footsteps of something walking across the roof of the house, with no hurry and no fear, mapping the surface, testing its weight, learning where the beams were strong and where the wood was thin. We listened, nobody moved. The fire had burned down to embers, and the only light in the room was a faint orange glow from the coals and the pale blue screen of my phone, which I held against my chest like a talisman. Above us, the footsteps continued, back and forth, in a pattern that slowly, horribly began to resemble pacing. Not random movement, pacing, the way a person paces outside a closed door while deciding whether to knock. Then it moved to the walls. The footsteps left the roof with a sound I cannot adequately describe. A heavy, wet thud against the exterior wall, as if something had stepped off the edge of the roof and caught itself against the side of the house. Then scraping. Long, slow scraping, moving downward. Claws or nails or fingers dragging across the wood siding. It reached ground level. I could track its position by the sound, moving along the south wall, pausing at each window, pressing against the glass. Not hard, just enough to make the panes creak in their frames. Testing, checking, looking for weakness. It moved to the east wall. The same pattern. Scrape, pause, press. The windows on these sides weren't boarded, only curtained, and when it pressed against the glass of the easternmost window, I heard the faintest squeak, the sound of something smooth being dragged across the surface of the pane, and I understood with nauseating clarity that it was pressing its face against the glass, that it was looking in, that the only thing between its eyes and ours was a thin cotton curtain and a line of coarse salt on the windowsill. It didn't try the north side. It didn't need to. The north windows were already boarded. It knew that. It had been here before, many times before, and it knew the architecture of this house's defenses the way a chess player knows the board. The voices came next. They started softly, murmuring from somewhere outside, directionless, so quiet that at first I wasn't sure I was hearing them at all. But they grew louder, and they multiplied, overlapping, a chorus of whispered names and phrases and half-sentences spoken in voices that I recognized and voices that I didn't. My name, Danny's name, Marcus's name. Fragments of conversations we'd had around the campfire, replayed with uncanny accuracy, our own words given back to us by a mouth that had no right to them. Then it found the voice that broke Marcus. Marcus, an old man's voice, thin, weathered, the voice of someone who has spent decades breathing dry desert air. Marcus, I made a mistake. Marcus, who had been sitting against the wall with his arms crossed and his jaw locked, went rigid. Every muscle in his body tightened at once, as if he'd been hit with an electric current. Marcus, let me back in, please. I didn't mean to leave. I got confused. It's dark out here, and I can't find the door. It was Elias's voice. The grandfather Marcus had scattered to the wind just hours ago. The man whose ashes were still settling into the red earth of the mesa. That man's voice, coming from outside the north wall, tired and frightened and achingly sincere. Marcus, please, I'm so cold. I've been out here so long. Just open the door. Let me come home. Marcus put his hands over his ears. He pressed hard, knuckles white, fingertips digging into his skull. He bent forward until his forehead touched his knees, and he stayed there, folded in half, and his body shook with the effort of not responding, of not getting up, of not walking to the door and opening it and reaching out for the grandfather he loved and lost and never properly mourned. I crawled to him. I put my hand on his back. I could feel him trembling through his jacket. It's not him, I said. Marcus, it's not him. I know, Marcus whispered. I know it's not him. But it sounds just like him. It sounds exactly like him. The voice continued for another 10 minutes. It cycled through emotions the way a musician cycles through keys. Pleading, confused, sad, angry. Marcus, why won't you help me, after everything I did for you? Disappointed. I protected this place for 30 years and you won't even open the door. And finally, just before it stopped, something that wasn't any of those things. Something cold and flat and stripped of all pretense. Elias's voice, but emptied of Elias. A vessel without its contents, speaking 3 words that I will never forget. I see you. Then silence. We had perhaps 10 minutes of quiet before the new sound started. It came from below, from directly beneath the floor of the main room. A scratching, faint at first, like mice in the walls, like something small and mundane that you could explain away if you tried hard enough. But it grew. It became rhythmic, deliberate, and then it became pounding. Something was beneath us. Something was in the root cellar, the cellar whose only entrance was outside, around the back of the house, sealed with 3 heavy padlocks, and it was hammering against the underside of the floor with a force that made the boards vibrate under our sleeping bags. Marcus stood up. That's impossible, he said, but his voice had the quality of someone saying the word impossible while watching the impossible happen. The cellar entrance is outside. It's padlocked. 3 locks. I checked them this afternoon. Is there another way in? I asked. A trapdoor? A tunnel? I don't know. He never let me near the cellar. Not once. Not even as a kid. The pounding intensified. It found a rhythm. 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 beats, matching the pattern of the knocking at the door from earlier in the night. Whatever was doing this was communicating. Not with us. With the thing outside, coordinating. Call and response, above and below. Then the pounding stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something worse. The padlocks. From outside, from around the back of the house, I heard metal moving. The heavy, rusted hasp of an old padlock being manipulated by fingers that knew exactly what they were doing. A click. Quiet, clean, decisive. The sound of a lock opening. I counted. Click. 10 seconds of silence. Click. 10 more seconds. Click. 3 padlocks. 3 clicks. Whatever was outside had opened them without a key, without tools, without force. It had opened them because it understood them, because locks are designed by humans, and this thing had been studying humans for a very long time. I looked at Marcus. He looked at the floor. We both heard the cellar door creak open. We heard footsteps below us. Inside the cellar now, moving slowly, exploring. The ceiling of the cellar was the floor we were sitting on, and the footsteps passed directly beneath me, and I could feel the vibration through the boards, and I pulled my legs up and wrapped my arms around my knees, and made myself as small as possible, because some irrational, childlike part of my brain believed that if I didn't touch the floor, whatever was beneath it couldn't reach me. The footsteps circled the cellar, then they stopped, and then nothing. No sound from below, no sound from outside, just the 5 of us in a dying circle of firelight, surrounded on all sides, above and below and beyond the walls, by something we couldn't fight, because we couldn't see it, and couldn't understand it, and couldn't even agree on what to call it. It was sometime around 3 when Danny started behaving strangely. She had been lying on her sleeping bag, curled on her side, facing the boarded north window, and I hadn't been watching her because I'd been focused on the sounds. So I don't know exactly when it started. I don't know if there was a gradual change or a switch that flipped. I just know that at some point, I looked over and she was sitting up perfectly straight, her hands resting on her knees, staring at the boarded window with an expression that I can only describe as serene. Serenity had no business being in that room. "Danny," I said. She didn't respond. She stood up, smoothly, gracefully, like a dancer rising on cue. She took a step toward the north wall, then another. "Danny, sit down." She turned to look at me, and her eyes were wrong. Not the color, not the shape, the focus. They were glassy, diffused, as if she was looking at something behind me, through me, at something in a place I couldn't access. Her pupils were dilated so wide that her irises were thin rings of color around black pools. "I need to go outside," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. The calm of someone who has stopped fighting. "No, Danny, no. Sit down." "It's showing me something beautiful," she smiled. A real smile, warm and wondering. The smile of a child seeing snow for the first time. "Can't you see it? The lights are back. They're right outside. They're so beautiful, Joel. They're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." There were no lights. I was looking at the same boarded window she was looking at, and there was nothing there. No glow between the planks, no illumination. Nothing but old wood and old nails and darkness beyond. But Danny was walking toward it with her hands outstretched, reaching for something only she could see, and her face was radiant with a joy that was obscene in its inappropriateness. And she was 2 steps from the window when I grabbed her arm. She fought me. She fought me with a strength that was not proportional to her body. Danny is 5'4" and 120 pounds, and she nearly threw me off. I shouted for Ray, and Ray was there, slow and diminished, but still big enough to matter. And together, we pulled her back from the window, and held her against the floor while she thrashed and whispered, "Let me go, let me go. I need to see the lights. Please, they're so beautiful. Please just let me go." It lasted 4 minutes. I know because Sophie was counting out loud, a low, steady count that served as both measurement and anchor, giving us something human to hold on to while Danny twisted in our arms and begged to be released to whatever was calling her. Then it stopped. Danny went limp. Her eyes cleared. She blinked, looked at me, looked at Ray's hands on her shoulders, and said, "Why are you holding me down?" She didn't remember. The last 4 minutes were gone. A hole in her timeline, a blank space where something else had been driving. And the terrified confusion on her face when we told her what she'd done was worse than the episode itself because it meant the thing wasn't just outside the walls anymore. Sophie said it quietly, almost to herself. "It's learning us. It's getting in." I don't know what made me think of the phone. Maybe it was the journalist in me, grasping for documentation, for evidence, for the tangible proof that my profession had trained me to prioritize above all else. Maybe it was something simpler, a desperate need to look at something other than the faces of my friends. Whatever the reason, I turned to Ray sometime after 3:30 and asked him to pull up his phone. "The footage from the UFO," I said. "I want to look at it again." Ray stared at me like I'd asked him to solve a crossword puzzle during an earthquake, but he pulled out his phone. He unlocked it. He opened the camera roll, and then he stopped scrolling. "Joel." His voice was barely a whisper. "Joel, come look at this." I moved to his side. He angled the screen toward me. I saw his camera roll, the usual grid of thumbnails, and among them, 5 photographs that neither of us had taken. They were time-stamped. The first was from the previous night, during the hours when we'd been asleep in our tents. It showed our campsite from above, from a height of perhaps 8 feet, looking down. The tents were visible, the dead fire was visible, and in one of the tents, through the thin nylon, the vague shapes of sleeping bodies were visible. The photograph had been taken from directly above us, while we slept, by something standing over our tents, looking down, holding Ray's phone. I swiped to the next image, Marcus sitting by the fire, taken from the tree line, the juniper branches framing the shot like a window. The distance was maybe 150 yards, but the zoom was impossibly tight. Marcus's face in sharp focus, the fire casting shadows across his features. And the angle was from slightly above, as if the photographer was very tall or standing on something elevated. The third photograph, me, in Elias's study, reading the journal. The shot was taken from a high angle, from the corner of the ceiling, looking down at me as I bent over the desk. Inside the house. While we were all inside the house. While the doors were locked and the salt was in place, and we believed, we desperately, foolishly believed, that the walls were keeping something out. The fourth photograph. All 5 of us, standing on the mesa, scattering the ashes. Taken from behind us, from maybe 10 feet back. We were in a row, heads bowed, the wooden box in Marcus's hands, the ashes just beginning to catch the wind. We had been alone on that mesa, I was certain of it. I had looked in every direction. There was no one behind us, nothing behind us. And yet something had stood 10 feet from our backs and raised a phone and taken a photograph, and we hadn't heard a thing. The 5th photograph. I need a moment before I describe the 5th photograph. I need you to understand that I am not exaggerating. I am not embellishing. I am telling you what I saw on that screen in the exact terms in which I saw it. And if the description seems impossible, that's because it was impossible, and it happened anyway. The 5th photograph was a close-up of a face, taken from perhaps 6 inches away, a selfie distance, the face filling the entire frame. And the face was wrong. Not inhuman, not monstrous, wrong. It was assembled from pieces, Marcus's jawline, Ray's brow, my nose, Danny's cheekbones, Sophie's mouth. 5 faces combined into one composite, stitched together not with seams but with the seamless fluidity of something that understood human faces well enough to build one from components, but didn't quite understand what made a face a person. The proportions were almost right. The symmetry was almost natural. The skin tone shifted subtly across the surface, darker at the jaw, lighter at the forehead, as if the thing was still deciding what color to be, and it was smiling. The same too wide smile that Ray had described, the one with too many teeth. Ray dropped the phone. It hit the floor face down, and the sound of the screen striking the wood was sharp and final, like a door closing. Nobody picked it up. We sat in the darkness. The fire was dead. The lanterns had burned low, their wicks drowning in the last of their oil, casting a light so thin it barely reached the walls. We were 5 shapes in a dying room, and outside, something that had stolen our faces and our voices and our phones walked the perimeter of the property with the patience of a thing that has no deadline. I watched the windows, the boarded ones, the curtained ones. I watched the floor, thinking about the cellar beneath us with its open door and its broken locks. I watched my friends. I watched Sophie with her knees drawn up, murmuring something I couldn't hear in a language I didn't recognize. I watched Marcus sitting by the door with his hand resting on the iron bolt, as if he could hold it shut by force of will. I watched Ray, lying on his side, facing the wall, a man who had survived a war and been defeated by a smile. I watched Danny, asleep somehow, or something close to sleep, her brow furrowed, her lips moving soundlessly, dreaming of lights that only she could see. I did not pray. I have never been a religious man, but I made a bargain with whatever runs the universe. I said, silently, inside my head, where nothing could hear me, or so I hoped. Just let the sun come up. Just let it be morning. I will never come back to this place. I will never speak of this again. Just give me the sun. At 5:14 a.m., the sky began to change. The darkness didn't retreat so much as thin. The blackness softened to charcoal, then to ash, then to the pale, washed-out gray that precedes dawn in the desert. The first light touched the top of the mesa and crept down its face like water running in reverse. And as it reached the house, as it touched the walls and the windows and the boarded planks, something happened. The pressure lifted. I don't know how else to describe it. It was physical, tangible, as real as the weight of a hand on your shoulder. All night, there had been a pressure, an invisible density in the air, as if the atmosphere inside the house had been slowly compressed by the presence outside it. And as the light arrived, that pressure released, like an exhalation, like something that had been holding its breath for hours finally letting go. The sounds stopped, the footsteps, the voices, the scratching from the cellar. All of it, gone not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had turned off a switch. The silence that replaced them was different from the silence of the night. This silence was empty, clean. The silence of absence rather than presence. Whatever had been surrounding us had withdrawn. We sat there for 20 minutes after dawn, not speaking, not moving, barely breathing, watching the light crawl across the floor and touch our sleeping bags and warm the room that had been so cold, and slowly, painfully, like survivors crawling from rubble, we began to believe that we were still alive. Marcus stood first. He walked to the front door. He put his hand on the iron bolt. He paused. Then he slid it open and turned the deadbolt and unhooked the chain and opened the door. Morning, clean, golden, unambiguous morning. The desert stretched out before us, red and still and bathed in light that was just light. Not a warning, not a lie, just the plain, honest light of a star 93 million miles away, doing the only thing it knows how to do. Marcus turned to us. His face was older than it had been 24 hours ago. Older by years, not hours. "We leave," he said. "Now. We pack nothing. We just go." No one argued. Not Ray, not Danny, not Sophie, not me. We just went. We moved like people escaping a fire. No coordination, no discussion. Just the raw, primal arithmetic of survival. Keys, ignition, go. Marcus was in his truck first, engine running before the rest of us had crossed the porch. Ray climbed into the passenger seat beside him, moving with none of the easy athleticism I'd known for 12 years. He moved like an old man, like someone whose body had become a place he didn't trust. He pulled the door shut and stared straight ahead through the windshield, and I don't think he blinked. I got Danny and Sophie into my SUV. Danny sat in the front. Sophie took the back seat and immediately pressed herself against the door, as far from the center of the vehicle as she could get, her forehead against the glass, her eyes closed. She was murmuring again, that quiet stream of words in a language I didn't speak. And I didn't ask her to stop because I understood that whatever she was saying, it was a wall she was building. And walls were the only things keeping any of us together. Marcus pulled out first. I followed. The dirt road stretched ahead of us, straight and pale against the red earth, cutting through the scrubland toward the highway 22 miles to the east. The morning light was clean and hard, and the desert looked exactly the way a desert is supposed to look at 7 in the morning, flat and dry and indifferent. And I told myself that we were leaving and it was over and the night was behind us and the road was just a road. I checked the rearview mirror. I don't know why. The same instinct that makes you look over your shoulder when you feel eyes on the back of your neck, some ancient limbic compulsion to confirm that the thing chasing you is falling behind. The ranch house was receding behind us, shrinking in the mirror, and standing in the doorway was a figure. It was shaped like Marcus. It was wearing Marcus's clothes from yesterday. The flannel shirt, the worn jeans, the boots he'd had since college. It was standing in the doorway of the ranch house with one hand raised, palm open, waving. A slow, casual wave. The wave of a friend seeing you off. The wave of a man standing in his own doorway on a pleasant morning, saying goodbye, take care, drive safe, come back soon. Marcus was in the truck ahead of me. I could see him through his rear window, both hands on the wheel, his silhouette unmistakable. The thing in the doorway continued to wave. It got smaller as we drove, and smaller, until the ranch house was a dot in the mirror and the figure was a speck within the dot. And then both were gone. I didn't mention it. I have never mentioned it. I am mentioning it now because this is the story. All of it. Every piece, and leaving things out is how they grow in the dark. We drove. The road was straight. Marcus set a pace that was faster than the terrain wanted, the truck bouncing over ruts and washouts, kicking up a rooster tail of dust that I drove through with my headlights still on. The sun climbed. The desert brightened. 7 miles of straight dirt road, and with every mile I felt the pressure in my chest loosen by a fraction. Then Marcus's brake lights came on. His truck slowed and stopped. I pulled up alongside him, driver's window to driver's window. Marcus was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles bloodless. Ray was still staring forward, but now his mouth was slightly open, and his expression was the expression of a man watching something that his brain is refusing to process. "Something's wrong with the road," Marcus said. I looked ahead. The road continued beyond his truck, curving gently to the left, bending in a wide arc through the scrubland before disappearing behind a low rise. A curve, a perfectly normal, perfectly unremarkable curve in a dirt road. Except this road didn't curve. We had driven in on this road yesterday. I remembered it specifically because I'd commented on how straight it was, how you could see for miles ahead without a single bend, how the road ran like a ruled line from the highway to the ranch with no deviation. 22 miles of straight road, no curves, not one. "That wasn't there before," Danny said from beside me. She was leaning forward, hands on the dashboard, squinting at the bend ahead. We drove forward anyway. What else could we do? Turn around? Go back to the house where something wearing Marcus's face was waving from the doorway? We followed the curve. It bent left, then straightened, then bent left again. A long, lazy spiral that felt wrong beneath the tires. The kind of wrong that you feel in your inner ear before you feel it in your mind. The landscape outside the windows was the same, sage and rock and sand and sky. And yet it wasn't the same, because we had been driving east for 20 minutes, and the sun should have been ahead of us and to the right, but it was behind us and to the left, which meant we were heading west now, which was impossible because we hadn't turned around. Then I saw the ranch house, ahead of us, sitting on the flat red earth exactly where we'd left it, the barn leaning to the east, the windmill turning in its phantom breeze, the sun striking the roof at the same angle it had struck it when we'd pulled away. We had driven in a circle. 7 miles of road had bent back on itself and delivered us to the place we were trying to leave. Sophie made a sound from the back seat, not a word, a sound. The sound of someone who has just had her worst suspicion confirmed. "It's not letting us leave," she said. We tried again. Marcus led. I followed. We drove faster this time, aggressive, deliberate, Ray leaning out of the truck window and watching the landscape for the moment when the road would betray us. We made it further, maybe 10 miles, the road straight and true and east running, and hope built in my chest like a bubble, fragile and iridescent. And then the road curved again, a long, impossible arc that delivered us, gently and inevitably, back to the ranch house. The third attempt was mine. I told Marcus to follow me. I opened the compass app on my phone and set it on the dashboard where I could see it. Due east. The needle pointed east, and I drove east, and I watched the needle, and it never wavered. Not once, not by a single degree. The compass said east for 22 unbroken minutes, and at the end of those 22 minutes, with the needle still pointing east, the ranch house appeared in my windshield like a destination I'd been driving toward all along. The compass was right. The road was right. We were heading east, and the east led back to the house. as if the land itself had folded, as if the geography around the ranch had been gathered up like a tablecloth and stitched into a loop, so that every direction led to the same center. Marcus stopped his truck in front of the house. He sat for a moment, engine idling, both hands on the wheel. Then he turned the engine off. He opened the door. He got out. He walked to the middle of the dirt road, his boots raising small puffs of dust with each step, and he stood there, a man alone in the center of an impossible geometry. And he turned to face north, the tree line, the junipers, the place where the figure had stood at dusk. And Marcus shouted. He shouted with everything he had, his voice cracking, his fists clenched at his sides, his whole body rigid with the effort of projecting his voice across the 200 yards of flat, silent desert between him and the trees. What do you want? The words hit the tree line and died. No echo. The desert swallowed them the way it had swallowed every sound since we'd arrived, consuming the vibration, leaving nothing behind. Silence. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Then a voice. Not from the tree line, not from the house, not from any direction I could identify. A voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, that rose from the ground and fell from the sky and pressed in from every side simultaneously, as if the desert itself had opened its mouth. Elias's voice. But different this time, not the frightened, pleading voice from the night. Not the confused old man begging to come home. This voice was calm, clear. The voice of a man stating a simple fact. Close the cellar. Marcus stood very still. I watched him from behind the windshield of my SUV, and I watched the understanding arrive on his face the way dawn had arrived on the mesa. Slowly, and then all at once. His expression shifted, his shoulders dropped, his fists unclenched. He turned and walked toward the house, not running, walking. With the measured, resigned stride of a man who has just understood something he should have understood hours ago. Marcus, wait, I called, stepping out of the SUV. What are you doing? What he did, Marcus said without turning around, what he spent 30 years doing. I followed him. Danny and Sophie stayed in the car. Ray climbed out of the truck and trailed behind us at a distance, unwilling to go back into the house but unable to let Marcus go alone. The cellar entrance was around the back of the house, a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the foundation, the kind of door you'd see on an old farmhouse tornado shelter. The 3 padlocks lay on the ground beside it, open, their halves hanging loose. The cellar door was ajar, propped open an inch by a rock that hadn't been there before, as if something wanted to make sure it wouldn't accidentally swing shut. Marcus kicked the rock away. He pulled the door open. The hinges screamed, rusted metal on rusted metal, and below us, stairs descended into darkness. Dirt walls, the smell of earth and something older than earth, something mineral and cold. The smell of a place that has been sealed for a long time and has developed its own atmosphere. Marcus went down. I went after him. I turned on my phone's flashlight and held it ahead of us like a weapon, and the beam cut through the darkness and found the cellar. It was small, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet. Dirt floor, dirt walls, old wooden shelves along 2 sides, holding mason jars and rusted tools and coils of wire. A workbench against the far wall, its surface covered in dust so thick it looked like fur. And in the center of the floor, a circle, drawn in ash and salt, maybe 5 feet in diameter, the line about 2 inches wide. Within the circle, symbols. The same symbols I'd seen scratched into the door frames upstairs, repeated in a pattern that spiraled inward toward the center, growing smaller and more intricate as they approached the middle, where a single mark, a shape I didn't recognize and can't reproduce, sat like a signature. The circle was broken. A section roughly 2 feet wide had been swept clean. The ash and salt had been scattered, dispersed across the dirt floor as if a hand or a foot had deliberately wiped through the line. The symbols on either side of the break were intact, but the continuity was gone. The circuit was open. Whatever the circle had been designed to contain, or repel, or hold in place, it was no longer doing its job. Marcus knelt beside the break. He stared at it for a long time. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a handful of salt, the same coarse salt from the canister upstairs, and he began to redraw the line. His hands were shaking. The salt scattered unevenly, and he swept it into place with his fingertips, pressing it into the dirt, working it into a line that was rougher and less precise than Elias's original, but unbroken. Continuous. He worked from memory, fragments of watching his grandfather through a cracked door when Marcus was 8 or 9, moments he'd thought were meaningless at the time and now understood were lessons. He redrew the symbols on either side of the break, approximating them, his finger tracing shapes in the ash and salt with the uncertain confidence of someone who knows the melody, but not the words. He went slowly, he went carefully. He wiped away mistakes and started again. He didn't rush. When he was done, the circle was whole, not pretty, not elegant. A rough, desperate repair made by a man working from childhood memory in a dark cellar, while something unspeakable waited above. But whole, unbroken, complete. Marcus stood up. He looked at the circle for a moment longer. Then he climbed the stairs. I followed. He closed the cellar door. He replaced the 3 padlocks, snapping each one shut with a decisive click, the inverse of the sounds we'd heard during the night. Then he walked to the tool shed beside the barn and came back with a 4th padlock, heavy and new, still in its packaging. He tore it open, threaded it through the last available ring on the hasp, and locked it. He stood on the cellar door. He put his hands at his sides. He lowered his head and said words I couldn't hear. I was standing 5 feet away, and I couldn't hear them. They might have been English. They might have been something else. They might have been the words Elias said, the words his grandmother said, the words that had been passed down through a chain of guardians that stretched back further than any of us could imagine. When he was done, he stepped off the door and looked at me. "Let's try the road," he said. We got back in the vehicles. Marcus led, I followed. The dirt road stretched ahead of us, straight and pale and east running, and this time it stayed straight. No curves, no bends, no impossible geometry folding us back toward the center. 22 miles of dirt became 2 lanes of cracked asphalt, became a county highway, became an interstate on-ramp. And with each transition, with each step back toward the world we knew, the desert released its grip on us 1 finger at a time. Nobody spoke, not on the dirt road, not on the county highway, not on the interstate. 4 hours of driving in a 2-car convoy, and not a single word was spoken. I watched the rearview mirror for the first 100 miles. I watched for a truck that shouldn't be following us, for a figure standing on the shoulder of the road, for the landscape to bend and loop and deliver me back to a sun-bleached ranch house with boarded windows and a cellar full of ash and salt. The mirror showed only road, only distance, only the long, straight line of highway stretching back toward a place I would never return to. At some point, I realized I was crying. Not sobbing, just tears running down my face silently, the way water runs down a window. I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall. They were the most honest thing about me in that moment, the only response I had that hadn't been filtered through rationality or pride or the professional composure I'd spent my entire career constructing. I cried because we were alive. I cried because we almost weren't. And I cried because some part of me, the part that used to believe in a world made entirely of things I could explain, had died on that mesa, and I was going to have to learn to live without it. We didn't talk about it. Not on the drive home, not the next day, not the next week. We scattered the same way we'd scattered Elias's ashes, silently and in every direction, carried by forces we didn't choose and couldn't control. Ray flew back to Virginia. Danny drove to Denver, where she'd been living. Sophie went somewhere she didn't tell any of us. Marcus stayed in Salt Lake. I went back to my apartment and I sat on my couch and I stared at the wall and I did not write a single word for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of nothing. 3 weeks of going to work and sitting at my desk and looking at my screen and producing nothing. My editor asked if I was okay. My neighbor asked if I was okay. The barista at the coffee shop I went to every morning looked at me with the particular concern that strangers reserve for people who are clearly not okay but haven't been asked the right question yet. I told everyone I was fine. I was not fine. I was carrying something inside me that was too large for my body and too heavy for my mind, and it sat in the center of my chest like a stone, and every breath I took had to work around it. I called Marcus on a Tuesday night. I don't know why Tuesday. Maybe because Tuesdays are ordinary. Maybe because I needed ordinary. He picked up on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He said, "I was wondering when you'd call." We talked for 2 hours. It was the longest conversation we'd had since college, and most of it was silence. The comfortable, necessary silence of two people who share a thing that no one else would believe. We didn't rehash the details. We didn't debate what we'd seen. We didn't try to explain it or categorize it, or fit it into a framework that would make it manageable. We just sat on the phone, breathing, existing in the same moment across 700 miles, and it was the closest thing to peace I'd felt since the ranch. Marcus had been back. That was the first thing he told me, and it landed like a fist. "Once," he said before I could object. "During the day, I drove out on a Saturday morning and I was gone before noon." "Why?" "Because somebody has to." He'd checked the cellar. The padlocks were still locked. All 4. He'd added more salt to the windows. He'd replaced 2 of the mirrors on the perimeter posts that had cracked over the winter. He'd walked the property and checked the bone piles at the compass points, and reset the one on the north side that had been disturbed by wind or animal or something else. And he'd found more of Elias's journals. Not just the one in the study, others hidden throughout the house. In the back of the bedroom closet, under a loose floorboard in the kitchen, sealed in a plastic bag inside the water tank. Elias had been writing for 30 years, documenting everything, and he'd hidden the journals in different places as if he knew that someday someone would need to find them, and he wanted to make sure that no single act of destruction could eliminate them all. Marcus was still reading them. He said he'd be reading them for a long time. "My grandfather wasn't crazy," Marcus said. His voice was steady now, steadier than I'd heard it in months, and it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The weight of purpose, of inheritance. He was a guard. He was standing at a post that somebody has to stand at, and he stood there for 30 years, and when he couldn't stand anymore, he died. And the post was empty, and the circle broke, and we showed up just in time to see what he'd been holding back. "And now?" I asked. "Now I stand there." I didn't argue. I didn't tell him it was dangerous or foolish, or that he should sell the property and never look back. Because I understood, in the way that you understand a thing not through logic but through the deep, structural knowing that sits beneath logic, that Marcus was right. Someone had to do it. Someone had to maintain the circle and refresh the salt and keep the mirrors clean and stand between whatever lived in that desert and everything south of it. Elias had done it alone for 30 years. Marcus would do it now. The guard had changed. The post remained. "He goes back every full moon." He told me that later, months later, in a conversation that was shorter and more practical. Every full moon, he drives 6 hours to the ranch, and he checks the cellar, and he walks the perimeter, and he maintains the protections, and he leaves before dark. He's never stayed past sunset. He says he never will. I asked him once if he's ever seen it again, during his visits, during the daylight. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I see it standing in the tree line sometimes, just standing there, watching me work. It doesn't come closer during the day, but it watches." "What does it look like?" Another long pause. "Different every time. We don't talk about the specifics anymore. The others changed. I should tell you how, because the story doesn't end when you leave the place where it happened. The story follows you. It sets up residence in the spaces between your thoughts, and it redecorates, and it never pays rent, and you can't evict it." Ray stopped joking, not gradually, not in the natural way that people mellow with age. He stopped, like a clock that's been unplugged. The man who once made an entire lecture hall laugh with a single word became the man who sits in the corner of the bar and nurses a single beer and watches the door. He sleeps with the lights on. Every light. Bedroom, bathroom, hallway, kitchen. His electricity bill is enormous, and he doesn't care because darkness is no longer a neutral state. Darkness is a hiding place, and he knows what hides in it. He checks every window before bed, locks, latches, curtains. He runs his finger along the sills. I don't know if he uses salt. I've never asked. I'm afraid of the answer. Danny moved to a new apartment 3 weeks after the trip. The old one had windows with heavy blackout curtains, the kind that cover the glass completely, and she couldn't look at them without seeing boards nailed in from the inside. She couldn't be in a room where the windows were obscured. She needed to see out. She needed to know that nothing was looking in. Her new apartment has floor-to-ceiling windows, and she keeps every one of them uncovered, even at night, even in winter. and she told me once that she'd rather be cold than blind. Sophie went home, to the reservation, to her grandmother's house, the place where she'd been told stories she was never supposed to repeat. She hasn't come back. She doesn't answer my calls. She responds to texts sometimes. Short messages, a word or two, enough to confirm that she's alive, but not enough to constitute a conversation. I think she's doing what her grandmother did. I think she's sitting in a kitchen somewhere, waiting for a 12-year-old to be old enough to hear the truth. Passing it down, adding our story to the chain. And me. I write this story. I write it because it's in me, and I can't leave it there. I write it because the alternative is pretending it didn't happen, and pretending is a kind of lie, and lies are how the circle breaks. There's one more thing. I've put it off long enough. The detail I've never told anyone. Not Marcus, not Danny, not my therapist, the one I started seeing in November who thinks I'm processing generalized anxiety, and whom I will never, ever correct. I shoot film. It's an old hobby, almost an affectation. I carry a 30-year-old Nikon on trips and shoot black and white because I like the grain and the weight of the camera, and the discipline of having 36 frames and no delete button. I brought the Nikon to the ranch. I shot a roll and a half over the 2 days we were there. Landscapes, mostly. The mesa, the sky, a few candid shots of the group. I developed the film 3 weeks after the trip. I do it myself in a dark room I built in my apartment closet, because I'm that kind of person, and because dark rooms are one of the few places where darkness still feels safe. Most of the frames were what I expected. Red rock, big sky, friends squinting in the sun. But one frame, shot on the first afternoon, taken within an hour of our arrival, stopped me. It was a casual shot of the group unloading the cars, Marcus carrying a cooler, Ray with a duffel bag over each shoulder, Danny laughing at something off camera. An ordinary moment, an ordinary photograph. Except in the background, in the doorway of the ranch house, standing just inside the threshold where the afternoon light gave way to interior shadow, there was a figure, tall, thin, proportions that weren't quite right, shoulders too narrow, arms too long, the geometry of a human body rendered by something that had studied humans but wasn't one. It was smiling. It was there on the first afternoon, hours before the UFO, hours before the silence, hours before the footsteps and the voices and the knocking. It was standing in the doorway of the house while we unloaded our cars and joked and laughed and popped open beers and talked about how beautiful the desert was. It was already there. It was waiting for us. People ask me about the lights. Everyone wants to hear about the UFO. And yes, we saw something in the sky that first night. Something real, something enormous and silent and impossible. Something that should have been the most important moment of my life. If I'd come home with nothing but that story, the 90 seconds of a triangular void drifting across the starfield with pulsing amber lights, it would have been enough. It would have been the story I told at every dinner party for the rest of my life. It would have defined me. But I'll tell you something. In all the years since that weekend, the 5 of us have never once talked about the UFO. Not once. Not a single phone call, not a single text, not one late-night conversation where someone says, "Remember the lights?" We saw something in the sky that defied every law of physics we've ever been taught, and we don't talk about it. We don't care about it. It doesn't keep us up at night. Because the thing on the ground was worse. The thing that knew our names was worse. The thing that wore our faces was worse. The thing that stood in the doorway and waved goodbye in my best friend's body was worse. The thing that learned our voices and spoke through the walls and the cadence of our mothers was worse. The thing that got inside Danny's head and showed her lights that didn't exist was worse. The UFO was above us, far away, untouchable, alien in the truest sense, something from somewhere else, something that had no personal interest in who we were. It passed over us the way a ship passes over fish. We were beneath its notice, and there is a strange comfort in being beneath the notice of something vast and unknowable, because it means the vast and unknowable thing doesn't care about you. And if it doesn't care about you, it can't hurt you. But the Skinwalker cared. The Skinwalker was intimate. It studied us, it learned us. It took our faces and our voices and our fears and our loves, and it used them against us with a precision that was not animal and not mechanical, but something worse than both. It knew which voice would break Marcus. It knew which memories would move Danny toward the door. It knew how to smile with Ray's face in a way that would dismantle a Marine. It knew us. And being known by something like that is the most terrifying thing I have ever experienced. More terrifying than the lights. More terrifying than the silence. More terrifying than the impossible road that bent us back to the place we were trying to escape. And the worst part, the part I haven't said, the part that sits at the center of everything, the stone in my chest that I carry everywhere and will carry until the day I die. I'm not sure it stayed there. Some nights, late, when the city is quiet and my apartment is dark except for the light I now leave on in the hallway, I hear knocking. 3 slow knocks, measured, patient, polite. The kind of knock a neighbor makes when they stop by to say hello. And then a voice, warm and familiar. A voice I almost recognize. Almost. Close enough that my heart responds before my brain can intervene. Close enough that my hand moves toward the door before I can stop it. I don't answer. I never answer.